Welcome to Patty for Liberty. Today I'm talking about transgender kids and all the anti-trans legislation that's been introduced this year. Is the transgender movement taking things too far, or are we all just transphobic? That's what I'm talking about today. I also wrote a blog post about this that you can find on my website, pattyforliberty.com. I will leave a link to that in the description. So I really want to get opinions and thoughts from libertarians, so please leave me some comments on what you think. And I'm going to be discussing a few different aspects of this issue that I'd like your thoughts on. When I was growing up, I didn't know anyone that was transgender. Nobody identified as transgender. You were either a man or a woman, a girl or a boy. Nobody identified as anything. You didn't choose your gender. You were just born with it. But as I've grown older, I've known quite a few transgender people, and I've had quite a few transgender friends and family. And within the libertarian community, we have always been welcoming to the transgender community. In fact, I think the Libertarian Party is largely responsible for the shift in our culture and our laws when it comes to LGBTQ rights and legislation. In my lifetime, I've seen us go from being gay and lesbian being completely unacceptable to where most people don't think it's a big deal. Even the Republican Party has finally decided that it's okay for people to be married if they're gay, and that we should just stay out of that. So we've come a long way on that. But now the new issue is transgender, and particularly transgender kids. And this is because there's a shocking or alarming number of kids who are now identifying as transgender. So I do think that there's some legitimate concern from parents and us older folks on what, and even within the transgender community, with whether or not these kids are making decisions about their gender at too young of an age. The number of teens who identify as transgender has doubled in the last 5 years. Over 300,000 13 to 17-year-olds now identify as transgender. And in fact, 43% of the transgender population, according to a report, and I don't have the name of it right on my notes, but it is in my blog post, 43% of our transgender population is under 25. So have we had a major, are more people just now realizing they're transgender that didn't used to come out with it openly, or are we persuading kids to think that they're transgender when they're not? That's what I want to talk about, and also the fact that there are now over 130 anti-trans legislation bills. According to the Human Rights Campaign, there were over 130 introduced in 2022. But are these even anti-trans? Much of the bills, I skimmed through quite a few of these state laws. Much of them had to do with sports and how a transgender woman or transgender female teen should be able to compete in sports. Should a biologically born male be able to compete in sports with women? And that's a legitimate issue, and I'm not going to weigh in on that one. The other bills that were introduced in many states were banning or preventing children under the age of 18 from getting puberty blockers or having gender-affirming hormones or being given having gender-affirming surgeries. So those were the bills, most of the ones that I read, that have been introduced, and they're legitimate concerns and questions, and I don't necessarily think people that are supportive of these legislations are anti-trans. But I do think we are having a major shift to where we're talking poorly of the trans community, and that they may be being discriminated against. And I want to speak to that because I want every transgender friend of mine and transgender family member to know that the Libertarian Party embraces people to practice their own lifestyles and beliefs, and we don't believe the government should impose moral rules and laws about how you practice your life. So In 2012, Joe Biden said, transgender discrimination is the civil rights issue of our lifetime. What do you think? Do you think that the transgender issue is the new civil rights issue? A lot of my friends who are either transgender or have transgender friends and family think that the trans rights is now the new gay rights. Now, Republicans and pretty much most of the world has let go of their laws and legislations against being gay, and most people don't care if you're gay or lesbian anymore. So now our big issue is trans rights. So a lot of people feel that way. But there are a lot of people who believe that this transgender, all these teens being transgender and young people calling them transgender, is just a craze. It's a social contagion. And I found tons and tons of YouTube videos on it being called a social contagion. Sorry, that one's hard for me to get out. Social contagion by many leading psychologists and authors and political people. In fact, Abigail Schreier, who wrote the book Irresistible Damage, The Transgender Craze Seducing Our Daughters, has made quite a bunch of controversy because a lot of people didn't like her book. It's been banned from Target. And then there's also a lot of people who thought her book was eye-opening, had really good information, and that she's being academically censored because the transgender movement doesn't like it. So I went through this weekend and read her book and read a lot on this issue. Her book was based on interviews and also findings from physician Lisa Littman, who was the first person to coin a few terms and describe this as a social contagion. She wrote a controversial paper that was published on Brown University, and it discussed her findings and her research when she interviewed 200 families of transgender teenage girls. So what she discovered as a physician was that she was starting to see groups of young teenage girls coming out as transgender, but groups like 4 or 5 girls in one small school suddenly coming out and saying they were transgender. So she started researching this by talking to their families and their parents. And this was the basis for the research for her paper and also the book by Abigail Schreier. So I wanted to read this research for myself because I do think there's some social component to why so many girls are now thinking they're lesbian or transgender, because it's much more socially acceptable. And in fact, I've talked to my own teen girls about how their school and how kids feel about this. So I do think there's some social connection to why there's more kids that are comfortable or coming out as transgender. But many of the adult transgender people will say they knew early in childhood that they were transgender. They knew that they weren't meant to be a boy or girl. They knew something was different about them early in childhood. And this is kind of the crux of her research. She was researching these children by talking to their parents. And the big thing that they discussed in the book and in her paper was that these girls did not have typical symptoms of gender dysphoria. In other words, they weren't talking to their mom and dad and saying, I'm supposed to be a girl and wearing pink clothes like transgender boys, how we've seen who have transgender dysphoria. They weren't girls saying, I'm supposed to be a boy and playing with trucks. They were typical girls according to the parents. So what she's done in her paper, the Lisa Littman, she described this phenomena where kids suddenly become transgender versus having early childhood symptoms and lifelong dysphoria about their gender, that she coined this as rapid onset gender dysphoria. And the majority of the girls in this book and this research paper, the author and the physician both speculate that this was done, that they decided to become transgender because of social contagion, that they were influenced by watching social media, by following YouTubers who were transgender, by their school, going to organizations within their school for transgender, lesbian, and gay people, that they were socially influenced to become transgender. They really didn't have gender dysphoria. So I wanted to read on this because I do think to some extent that people are more curious about being transgender because it's more talked about. But when I read through the book, I could tell that the author had a bias. The research she had written was based exclusively on the parents taking the parents' interviews, like how they felt their kids presented in early childhood. There was no discussion from Lisa or Abigail. They didn't talk to the teens. They didn't ask them, did you feel like you're a boy when you were a child? They just relied on the parents. And several of the parents expressed that their children had either considered them toxic or cut them off because they didn't support their transgender lifestyle, which leads me to speculate whether or not the parents are being genuine or if they just don't like their kids being transgender. Having known quite a few transgender young adults and seeing how their mothers treated them and that they eventually had to cut their mothers out of their life because they just refused to support them, I'm not sure that this book really got to the root of things because they only talked to the parents. And not to say that there might not be some truth to the information she got from the parents, but I don't think that the book or either of these research papers were written without bias because the kids weren't even involved in the research. So I would love to see further research where they actually talked to the transgender kids and said, did you always think you were transgender? Were you influenced by social media? I think some more research on the topic would be useful, and I don't think that would be anti-trans. That would just help us to understand people better. And so some of the concerns presented in the bills and legislation and in the book was these kids are making very big decisions with their body at such a young age. Should they be able to take puberty blockers just because they identify as a girl or a boy? Or are there harmful side effects that nobody's being informed of? Are we being too aggressive with these young kids? And should we intervene? So those are the questions I talked about on my blog and I'm talking about here. To me, I'm very pro-transgender, lesbian, gay, bisexual. I don't care what your preference is, and I don't think that any of these studies were fairly done. I'd love to hear what my transgender friends and family members of transgender folks say. Do you think people are becoming transgender because of being influenced by society, by social media, by the news, by their therapist? Do you think people are being influenced, or do you think most of these kids genuinely are transgender? And if so, or if not, is it the government's place to tell parents or parents how to get medical treatment for their children? Should parents and children and their doctors be in charge of this decision, or is it time that we start looking out for these kids because these hormone blockers and hormone changes that we're allowing our kids to take haven't really been researched very well? Should we have some laws protecting them? I would really love to know your thoughts as libertarians. What is the right libertarian solution? For me, I think the best option would be to provide more education, therapy, and counseling for both the parents and the children that are transgender. I would prefer to see people waiting till they're older to make these decisions because they are big decisions. But I would hate for the government to tell me what kind of treatment I should or shouldn't get my children who were in distress. So those are the conflicts. Is it the government's role to start setting some regulations? Are we being transphobic for being concerned about our kids? Or What do you think? I'm kind of leaving this open-ended because I'd really love to hear what libertarians think. Do you think that these bills are transphobic or anti-trans? And I'd particularly like to hear from my transgender friends. Do you think kids are making these decisions too early? Do you think that they know they're transgender? When they do you think they're being persuaded? What do you think has really changed between now and when we were growing up? Is it really that we're just more accepting, or is this a craze? Let me know what you think in the comments. This is one I'd really like to get some feedback on and maybe write another blog post on this, because I think this is going to be a big issue coming up. And I'd really love to hear what my libertarian and transgender friends think about this issue. Thanks for tuning in. If you like my content, if you support me as a libertarian and like that I'm not an echo chamber, I would totally appreciate your support by subscribing to my channel and clicking the like and leaving me a comment. Thanks, guys. I will have more content for you soon.